What is up, you guys? I hope you're doing well. I'm Tony Fuentes, and today we're analyzing and comparing wide-angle zoom lenses for the Sony E-mount system. This includes the A7 series cameras and the A6000s, so these lenses are useful for both full-frame and aps-c crop sensors. So the lenses that we're going to analyze today are the Sony 16-35 G Master, the Sigma 14-24 Art lens, and the Tamron 17-28. Now all these lenses have a fixed aperture or maximum aperture of 2.8, so that makes them very good in low light situations, as well as having a very shallow depth of field. So in this video we're going to compare the specs, see the pros and cons of each lens, as well as the overall quality of image of each lens. So for starters, guys, I have to state that this isn't a hands-on review. I don't have any of these three lenses physically, due to the fact that in my country it's quite difficult to acquire or to rent equipment. I'm sure some of you may relate to this. So instead I'm going to show you how to determine the quality of a lens through the MTF chart. So we're going to look into what they are, how to read them, and how to determine the quality of the image of a lens through those charts. Having said that, guys, let's get down to the specs and start comparing them. Okay, so in the specs, the first thing that we notice is the difference in focal length. We can see that Sony has a 16-35mm. That's 19mm from the minimal focal length to the maximum. That's a very versatile lens. Then the Sigma has only 10 between the 14 and 24, and the Tamron has 11 between 17 and 28. So alongside the focal length, I put on the equivalency on aps-c sensor cameras for the focal length, and you can see that in aps-c sensor cameras, they're all quite versatile lenses. So in focal length, the advantage goes to the Sony due to the fact that it's more versatile. At 16, you can use it for vlogging, for landscape photography, and at 35, it's a very nice focal length for portraits and for urban photography or whatever kind of photography, the 35. Meanwhile, the Sigma and the Tamron are quite limited due to the fact that these lenses are meant to be part of a series of lenses. The Sigma 14-24 is then complemented by the 24-70, meanwhile the Tamron is complemented by the 28-75. So these lenses aren't meant to be just bought single, they're meant to be complemented and bought with their bigger brother. Meanwhile, the Sony does have its counterpart, the 24-70, but if you wanted to go for just one lens, I would go for the 16-35. So the Sony takes the advantage in this case. Like I mentioned before, all these lenses have a maximum aperture of 2.8 and a minimum aperture of f22. So these lenses are fantastic. You can also find the f4 versions of these, and they'll probably be much cheaper. Now in minimal focal distance, guys, the Sony and the Sigma both can get as close to the subject as 28 centimeters or 11 inches. Meanwhile, the Tamron has a big advantage here, going up to 19 centimeters or 7.5 inches, so you can get pretty close up, almost to macro. So the Tamron has the advantage here. Now I've included aperture plates because this will determine the quality or the shape of the bokeh autofocus elements. So with more plates, the more circular or nicer bokeh that we'll have. So the Sony and the Sigma both have 11 blades. That's a very high quality glass. Meanwhile, the Tamron does go down to 9, and that means that the autofocus elements won't be as rounded, they'll be more like lemon shaped. So here the disadvantage goes to the Tamron. Okay, next we have the filter sizes, guys. Now I've mentioned filter sizes because the bigger the filter is, or the bigger the thread is, the more expensive they're gonna be. So the Sony has an 82mm thread. That's a very expensive thread. The UVs, the polarizers, or the NDs are gonna be quite expensive compared to the Tamron that only has 67mm. That's a quite inexpensive filter size. And if you add into account that the 28-75 also uses the same filters, that means you can save up some money in the filters. Next up, dimensions, and you can see that the Sigma is the biggest, next the Sony, and lastly but not least, the Tamron is a very portable lens. So I've included dimensions and the weight because the Sony cameras are quite small, and most of the times we want a balanced and small setup. Now, in case of the Sigma, it's the biggest of them all. It's quite a big lens. That's because it goes down all the way to 14. Then followed by the Sony 16-35. And finally, the Tamron is the most portable. We can see that in weight, the Sigma is very heavy. Meanwhile, the Tamron is the lightest and the most compact, only weighing 420 grams. So check mark to the Tamron. And finally, we come down to the price tag, which is the most determining factor into what lens to buy. Now, the Sony is $2,200. We have to state that the Sony is quite versatile, is the most versatile of all of these lenses. It's a Sony glass, so it's going to be expensive. But $2,000, you can buy a full frame body for that price. So it's quite expensive. That price tag is going to scare off many of us. Then comes the Sigma with $1,400. I don't consider it to be skimming off the top. It's not a ridiculous amount for the quality that we're getting. We're going to see on the MTF charts that it's very high performing. Then comes the Tamron with $900. Now this is the most inexpensive setup or the most budget solution for a wide angle zoom lens for the Sonys, but we have to check the quality on the MTF charts. Okay guys, so those are the specs. Now let's jump into MTF charts to see which lens has a better quality. So what are MTF charts? MTF charts are tests or graphical representations of a test of the modulation transfer function of a lens. In other words, they tell us how a lens will perform in sharpness and in contrast. Now these tests use a series of lines very close together to determine the performance of a lens throughout the whole sensor. So let's put up an MTF chart. Now in this case, the vertical axis has its values from 0 to 1. This indicates the quality, being 1 the highest score or the perfect performance, and 0 being the baddest. So the higher the lines are, the more perfect the image of the lens will be. And on the bottom axis, we can see the scale from 1 to 20. Now this represents the distance from the center of the sensor to the corner. Now a full frame sensor has a diagonal measurement of 43 millimeters approximately. So half of it is 21.5, the measurement that we see on the chart. So in this axis, we can see how well a lens maintains its performance throughout the whole image. A lot of times we can see that images tend to get less sharp and less contrast in the corners, and that's how this test comes into play. Now in the chart, we can see two colored lines. The red indicates the contrast of the lens, and the green indicates the sharpness. Now there's also two types of lines, the solid lines and the dotted lines. Now the solid lines represent the lines that run perpendicular towards the way the test is running, and the dotted lines represent the ones that go parallel. We're not going to get into that, but it's just worth mentioning. Now a little thing to notice is that the closer the dotted and the solid lines are together, the nicer the bokeh will be. The closer they are, the nicer and less noisier background we're going to get. Okay, so an ideal performance on an MTF chart would be represented with a horizontal straight line up in the 9s and the 1s. So that would indicate a high sharpness and contrast throughout the whole image, all the way from the center to the corners of the image. Now let's jump into the MTF charts of the Sony, the Sigma and the Tamron and see how they perform and how to analyze them. Now if we look at the Sony's MTF charts, we have two. We have the one at 16mm and the one at 35mm, both open an f2.8 aperture. Now the red lines, remember, is the contrast and the green lines represent the sharpness. And in the chart of the 16mm, we can see that the contrast is almost perfect. It starts at 100 in the center of the lens and just moves ever so slightly down towards the border. So the contrast at 16mm is pretty high. We can see that the contrast at the 35mm focal range is also very good. It just differs just a little bit from the 16mm. So in contrast, this lens is incredible. Now the green lines represent the sharpness, and as we can see in sharpness, it's not the best performance, but it is a high quality performance. We can see that at 16mm, it starts off at the 90s and ends up around the 70s. So it's a quite good performance in the point of the sharpness. Now at 35mm, it starts off as well as the 90s and drops all the way down to the 60s or the mid 60s. So it's still a good sharpness test. It's not an outstanding performance for sharpness, but it is a quite good one. Okay, now this is the Tamron. We can see at the left the 17mm at 2.8 aperture and at the right the 28 at the same aperture. Now in the 17mm we can see that the contrast is very high at the high 90s throughout the sensor. It just drops off quite a bit at the borders, so at the borders of the sensor this lens doesn't have as much of contrast. 28mm, the contrast maintains itself in the high 90s and only drops off to the 90s. So it's a very good performance for contrast in this case. Now as well, the performance of the sharpness, we can see it in a purple line in this case, is pretty irregular, and at 3/4 of the lens in both of the charts drops off quite a bit. So we can see it drops dramatically all the way down to the 20s in the 17mm and all the way down to the 40s in the 28mm. So in sharpness, it's not very good. Now in Sigma, we can see at the left the 16mm and at the right the 24mm. We can see that at 16 and at 24, we can see that the contrast is perfect. It's almost perfect, just dropping off just a little bit at the borders of the sensor, but still it's a fantastic performance in terms of contrast. We can see that at 14mm the sharpness does drop off just a bit at 3/4 of the lens, dropping down to the 70s. Meanwhile at 24mm it's quite an irregular performance, starting off at 85, goes up and down and ends up at 60s. So in sharpness it's not the best test, but it's still better than the Sony and the Tamron. Okay, so we can conclude through these tests that the Tamron has the worst image of the three. It has a good contrast and mediocre sharpness towards the borders of the image. Meanwhile, the Sony has an excellent contrast and a good sharpness, and the Sigma has an excellent contrast and a very good performance in sharpness. Once we finish with the MTF charts, now let's go down to the resume of each of the lenses. Okay, starting off with the Tamron 17-28, you're getting a decent enough image for $900. Quite a good image in contrast, not so sharp, but you're getting a very compact and lightweight solution. So if you're traveling or on the go, a 17-28 is quite a good lens. Okay, now with the Sony, it's a very huge price tag with $2,200. It has the quality, it has maybe not the best sharpest, but in contrast, it is very constant throughout all the image. So it's a very good image, and at 16-35 you have a very versatile lens that will help you in all kinds of situations. You can use it for portraits, for vlogging, for landscape photography. It's a very versatile lens, and considering that if you only buy one lens, I would buy the 16-35. Meanwhile, the Tamron and the Sigma, you would have to buy a portrait lens or a telephoto to complement each other. But for $2,200, I'm not willing to spend that much money on one lens, at least not yet. And lastly but not least, we'll come down to the Sigma. The Sigma for $1,400 comes with a very good image, excellent image I would say. If the charts don't lie, it has one of the best images I've seen in a zoom lens. So it's the biggest solution, it's quite heavy, it's the bigger in dimensions, but I think it's worth it because the quality of image is very high, and it's better than the Sony's quality and better than the Tamron, and it's $800 cheaper than the Sony. So I think it's a very good investment. The two aspects that I see as a negatives on the Sigma is the dimensions and weight, and secondly, the filters. You can't screw on filters on the front end of the lens. Instead, you have to take the lens out, put a gel filter in behind and screw it back onto your camera. So it's a bit of a hazard, but if you're willing to do it, the quality of the image surely backs it up. So that's the comparison for today, guys. I'm gonna go for the Sigma. It doesn't mean that you have to buy that one. Maybe you want the Tamron or you can afford the Sony, or there's other options that I've missed. Remember to put them down in the comments down below. Now in the description I put the links to these products. If you buy anything through these links, I get a little commission, so that's a way you can support me. And if you did like the video, can you please give it a like? It really makes a difference, and consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell to be notified when I upload the next video. I'm Tony Fuentes, cheers to all of you, and see you in the next one.